Hello, and welcome to Starbound. My name is I Am Duck, and I'll be your narrator. If you enjoy human-created HFY stories and want to support us, we're on Patreon now. You'll also get access to exclusive stories you won't hear anywhere else. Link is in the description. Now let's get into it. Chronicler Judson had presented the 40 worlds record 11 times. He had presented it to the Praxian High Conclave, where the assembly had risen in formal acknowledgement before he reached the third campaign. He had presented it to 3 planetary governors, 2 of whom had wept openly, and 1 of whom had commissioned a full architectural frieze of the campaign sequence for the outer wall of the Capitol building on Praxis Minor. He had presented it to the assembled delegates of the Outer Reaches Compact, who had spent the following session debating the implications for their own defensive posture in language that struck Judson as entirely reasonable. He had presented it twice to audiences that had not deserved the honor, and he had done so with the same care he brought to every presentation, because the record did not change for its audience. The Great Archive of the Galactic Concord was the 12th. He arrived in full ceremonial uniform, copper accents polished to their highest luster, the raised crest above his brow groomed close. His formal charcoal jacket pressed to the standard the occasion required. Several members of the archive staff acknowledged his entrance as he crossed the receiving floor. This was appropriate. The chamber was vast, the way galactic institutions made things, built to a scale that impressed by its very existence. Data slates lined the walls from floor to ceiling in dense formations, carrying the accumulated records of myriad species, conflicts and treaties, population surveys, the minutes of councils whose decisions had shaped the structure of known space. The air held the stillness of a place that had processed history rather than made it. Jen Keynes processed the submission with efficient brevity, long fingers moving across the intake terminal without ceremony or comment. Judson approved of this. Ceremony was for the record itself, not the filing of it. The human was already present. He was seated at a review terminal near the display stage, in plain academic robes that would not have distinguished him from a market administrator. Graying hair, calm, observant eyes that moved between the terminal screen and the room with an unhurried attention. He was making notes on something that was not the Praxian submission. He looked up when Judson entered, gave a brief nod, and returned to his work. Carson Flynn, the session brief read, Librarian, Terran Mandate Academic Commission. Judson had presented to academics before. They were, in his experience, either reverent, which was appropriate, or distracted. This one appeared to be neither. He noted this and set it aside. The record would address it. He activated the display. The 40 Worlds campaign opened as it always had, with 3 measures of the Praxian anthem, and then silence, and then the record. The first engagements were fleet actions in the outer systems against pre-contact species whose orbital defenses were admirable for their technological stage. Well organized, clearly the product of peoples who had been building toward the stars with genuine conviction and considerable ingenuity. The Praxian Expeditionary Fleet had met them with discipline and the careful management of force that distinguished a professional military operation from simple conquest. Compliance actions swift and contained, populations intact, cultures preserved. The species of the outer systems were now Concord members, their resources and capabilities contributing to something larger than their original ambitions had allowed them to envision. The record moved through the middle campaigns, where the engagements had been more complex. The 6th World had maintained a standing ground force that outnumbered the Praxian landing element by a ratio of 9-1, and the Praxian field commander had spent 18 months demonstrating, engagement by engagement, why numerical advantage alone did not resolve into victory against a force with superior doctrine and equipment. The documentation of that campaign was, in Judson's private assessment, some of the finest military record-keeping in Praxian history. Complete, verified, every command decision annotated with its rationale, and every outcome cross-referenced against the initial projected models. Then came the outer campaigns, where the transit distance had made resupply a genuine problem, and the logistical record was as impressive as anything in the combat documentation. The Praxian Logistics Corps had operated at ranges that should have made the campaigns difficult to sustain, and they had done it without losing a single world already brought into compliance. This was not celebrated the way the combat record was celebrated, but Judson had always believed it deserved to be. 43 cycles. 40 worlds. Judson narrated in measured cadence, as he always had, allowing the record its own weight. He knew where to lower his voice. In the third campaign, because those numbers carried meaning that required space around him, Flynn had been watching the display with the focused attention of someone reviewing a technical report. When it closed, he was quiet for a moment. Then he asked about the supply logistics for the outer campaigns, specifically how the resupply chains had been maintained across the transit distances involved. It was a good question. It was not the question Judson had expected, but it was technically sound, and he answered it fully. Flynn made a note. A remarkable logistical achievement, Flynn said. He was looking at the final image, the 40 worlds still glowing in copper against the back. Then he looked at Judson directly. 40 worlds. Is that all? The chamber was very quiet. Judson did not move. He was a chronicler, and he understood, in the part of his mind that handled such things, that a question asked in that tone, with that expression, in this setting, was not a failure of translation or a social error. It was an assessment. The aide said it was probably a translation issue. Judson stood at the viewport of his quarters aboard the diplomatic vessel, watching the station traffic pass without interest. He had not changed out of his ceremonial uniform. He was not sure why. He had worn it for the 12th presentation of the 40 Worlds record. He had expected to remove it with the satisfaction that came after a thing done well. He had not found it, not the way he had after the previous 11. Human communication carries nuance, the aide said. These things don't always transfer cleanly. It carried exactly the weight it carried, Judson said. The aide fell quiet. For a Praxian, the military record was not documentation. It was not a file or a submission or a piece of administrative procedure that could be reviewed and returned with marginal notes. It was the self set down in verified form. A question about the record was a question about the people who had made it. A question about 40 worlds was a question about what 3 generations of Praxian soldiers had given everything to build. Flynn had asked if that was all. Judson needed to understand the foundation of that question. A question asked from ignorance could be answered. A question asked from somewhere else entirely required something different, and he needed to know which kind this was before he could do anything useful about it. Access the public Terran mandate historical records, he said. Full index. The aide moved to comply. Judson stayed at the viewport for a moment, watching the traffic, thinking about what kind of people produced a question like that. The Terran mandate's public records were extensive and, by any meaningful standard, incomplete. The interstellar expansion was well documented. Colony foundations, trade routes, diplomatic records of first contacts, conducted with apparent competence. The steady outward growth of a species that had arrived at faster-than-light travel and then simply continued in the direction they had already been moving. There were resource surveys and population movement records and a detailed archive of treaty negotiations with 17 separate species, including 2 that had initially been hostile and were now firm allies. None of it was remarkable in scale, but it was clean and organized. The pre-contact era was different. There were references to it, summaries, approximated dates and compressed event descriptions that felt like someone attempting to account for a large thing in a small space. Global wars, a phrase used without definition, as though it required none. unification conflicts, the end of something called the nation-state period. Numbers appeared occasionally and without context, casualties described in the tens of millions in a single engagement. Production figures that, taken at face value, suggested an entire species' industrial capacity directed toward a single sustained conflict. The figures were not flagged as unusual within the human archive system. They were cited in the same administrative register as population movement data and trade volumes. Judson had spent enough time with records to know what it meant when a culture normalized something in its documentation. It meant that culture had stopped being surprised by it. He read those figures twice, the second time much more carefully than the first. The Praxian record cited total casualties across 40 worlds and all 43 cycles of a campaign at 912,000 dead. It was a number Judson had cited often, as evidence of professional execution and careful force management. He did not place it next to the human figures. Not yet. He did not have enough context to know what a comparison would mean. No chronicle, no single authoritative record compiled by a central body, verified by a standing historical commission, submitted to any archive with a proper certification seal. The human pre-contact era existed only as distributed fragments, individual national records in a dozen different languages, personal accounts, documentary, archives compiled by institutions that no longer existed in their original form. Not a chronicle, not even the framework for one, a scatter of source material that had apparently never been gathered into anything a Praxian historian would recognize as a formal accounting. Judson sat with this for a long moment. He was a chronicler. He had a category for everything. He went looking for the category and found nothing that fit. In Praxian terms, the absence of a chronicle meant one thing. A thing that was not recorded was a thing that had not been considered significant enough to record. The Praxian record went back 600 cycles. Every engagement and compliance action and logistics decision documented, verified and preserved, because the chronicle was the measure of a people. A people without a chronicle was a people without a measure. He understood, in theory, that other species had different approaches to historical record-keeping. He could not, in practice, understand how a species with no meaningful chronicle carried itself the way Flynn had. He filed a request for a meeting with Flynn. Flynn received him in the archive's consultation wing, in a corridor between cross-reference data stacks that reached from floor to ceiling. He was eating something from a small container, seated at a work terminal, with the relaxed focus of someone in the middle of something else entirely. He did not stand when Judson entered. Judson stated his position in formal terms. He had reviewed the Terran Mandate's public historical record. It was incomplete by any standard of honorable accounting. No central chronicle, no verified compilation, no certification of completeness or accuracy from any standing authority. In Praxian chronicle doctrine, a record that could not be properly assessed could not serve as the basis for any evaluation, and a proper evaluation had been implied by the question asked during his presentation in the archive. He was not making a request. He was stating a requirement. Flynn listened without interruption. He finished what he was eating. He set the container aside. "Context is required," Flynn said. "I will provide it." He said it without reluctance, without any indication that he was conceding anything. The same measured, dry cadence he used for everything, as though he had already decided, before Judson walked through the door, that this was a conversation worth having, and that now was the appropriate time. Judson had prepared for an argument. He had prepared the secondary citations of that doctrine, the formal precedent from the Outer Reaches Compact proceedings. 3 prior cases where incomplete accounting had been compelled by direct request at Concord level. He had prepared for resistance. There was none. He was not certain he had won anything. Flynn walked the lower corridors the way he did everything else, without urgency, without performance, as though arriving at a destination he had already accounted for. The thought came to him as he followed Flynn through the archive's lower passages toward a section he had not previously visited. The lower corridors were narrower than the receiving floors above, lined with terminals and storage racks. They passed the two other researchers who gave them no more than a glance. Flynn exchanged a brief word with one of them without breaking stride. Whatever facility they were heading to, he used it regularly. Judson followed this observation and kept pace with Flynn. Flynn had been here before. He had brought people here before. That, too, was not the same as winning an argument. The facility was small and dark and functional. It did not look like the access point to a historical record. It looked like a room where equipment was maintained between uses. 2 observer cradles against one wall, a calibration terminal, surfaces bare of anything not load-bearing. There was no plaque, no dedication, no indication that anything significant had ever been accessed here. Flynn ran calibration checks with the efficiency of someone who had done it before. He explained without preamble that the Terran Mandate's pre-contact military history existed only as distributed primary documentation. Individual unit records, tactical accounts, photographic and audio archives, personal testimony from participants and survivors. No central authority had compiled it into a formal record because, during the period in question, no single central authority had existed across the human homeworld to do so. The planet had been divided into independent nation-states, each maintaining its own records according to its own standards. Judson had understood, in the abstract, that humanity had been a fragmented civilization before contact. Every species was, before the survival pressures that had fragmented them resolved and centralization followed. What he had not previously considered was what fragmentation meant for the record. If there had been no central authority, there was no central accounting. The Chronicle could not exist because humanity was fragmented. The Concord's archive systems required a single certifying authority. There was none, so the record did not register as a Chronicle. What Flynn was offering was direct access to the primary source material, a full sensory simulation reconstructed from verified primary documentation. Observer placement, one engagement from one theater from one of the conflicts the public record had called a global war. He brought up a single file designation. Eastern Front, Sector 7G, Winter, 1942. This is unredacted, Flynn said. He did not explain what that meant or why he considered it worth stating. He said it and waited. Judson considered the cradle. He was a chronicler. He had spent his career with records in every form, from the carved stone tablets of pre-contact species to the most advanced holographic archive systems in Concord space. He had reviewed battle accounts and atrocity reports and the clinical documentation of extinctions. He understood that a record was a fixed thing, set down and complete, to be assessed from a professional distance. He had never before been told that a record required a warning before he reviewed it. He was a chronicler. Declining was not a category he possessed. "I will proceed," he said. He stepped into the cradle. The suite went dark. He was standing in a building that had already been destroyed. That was the first thing. The structure around him had ceased to function. The walls stood in places, their interiors exposed where impacts had opened them to the frozen air. The floors and ceilings had not fared better. Gaps and collapses opened sightlines to levels above and below. Through gaps where windows had been, the sky was the grey of old ash. Smoke moved in slow layers, carrying a compound chemical smell that Judson catalogued briefly and did not pursue. The floor beneath them, or what remained of it, was concrete and debris and the evidence of things that had occurred here before his arrival. The cold and the noise came after. The cold was absolute, present, unchanging, well below the threshold at which biological systems ceased to function at full capacity. The men around him were functioning, to some degree, anyway. The noise was wrong. He had reviewed fleet engagement audio. as part of his archival work. He knew the percussion of naval weapons at range, the rhythmic, organized discharge of infantry formations moving through a prepared assault, the controlled escalation of a coordinated attack, and the equally controlled resolution of its conclusion. This was none of those things. The noise here was layered and continuous and without rhythm, an overlapping accumulation of weapons fire and detonations that had apparently been running long enough to become its own form of silence. It was the sound of something that had no intention of stopping. Judson oriented himself. He was a witness. He was here to assess. He began with the command element. In any Praxian engagement of this scale, the command position was identifiable, set back from the forward line, elevated communications activity, a clear and consistent thread connecting it to the flow of the battle at every point. He found men moving through the wreckage of the floor above him, their uniforms the grey-brown of the human winter forces. He found men in different uniforms at the far end of the structure, moving in the opposite direction. He tracked both groups and looked for the element directing them, the position from which someone was managing the engagement from overview. He could not find it. The men were operating on their own assessment. Communication existed, but it was lateral, between individuals and small groups, not vertical through any command architecture he could isolate. He looked through a gap in the floor below, where men moved through rubble in a direction that implied an objective he could not identify from his position. He looked at the building as a whole system and tried to find the thread that connected its parts into a coordinated whole. There was no thread. He shifted his assessment to the objective itself. Men were dying for a stairwell. He examined it with care. A standard industrial structure, stone and metal, heavily damaged, no longer serving its original function. It was functionally identical to a dozen other stairwells visible through the wreckage of the same floor. He attempted to count the men engaging in taking it, the men engaged in holding it, and the men who had already ceased to be a factor in the engagement. He lost the count. There were too many in the last category, and the category was not remaining stable. Men advanced on the stairwell, took casualties, gained ground. Men from above came down to meet them, pushed back, retook that ground, and 2 steps more. The stairwell changed hands. He looked for the strategic logic that made it worth what was being paid for it. The building was destroyed. The stairwell connected a destroyed lower floor to a destroyed upper floor. Control of it did not restore the building's function. It did not open a route to anything he could identify as a strategic objective. He worked through the analysis methodically, from the available evidence, the way he could work through any record that did not immediately yield its meaning. He could not find a justification that resolved. He checked whether the stairwell provided elevation advantages for suppressive fire over the lower floor. It did not. The lower floor was already exposed from 3 directions through the damage to the structure. He checked whether its control denied the opposing force a primary route of approach. The opposing force had other routes across the same floor that were not being challenged. He checked whether the position held symbolic value within a command structure he had not been able to identify. A demonstration objective whose significance was cultural rather than tactical. He had no framework to assess this. He noted the gap and moved on. Across every accessible floor and corridor, separate engagements ran simultaneously. Through the largest gaps in the walls, the streets outside were visible for a short distance before wreckage and smoke closed them off. Men were moving there too under the same conditions against the same opposition. He looked further at what he could see of the city block beyond the immediate structure. Every building he could see was in the same state as the one he stood in, destroyed or being destroyed. Every accessible space contested at a level of intensity that had not diminished since his arrival. He looked for the shape of the whole, the outline that would tell him what this was for, what end state either side was building toward, and whether the engagement reached its conclusion. He could not find its edges. He could not determine where the engagement began or where it ended. The scale did not resolve into something manageable. It was simply larger than any frame he brought to it. And it had been running, at this scale, long enough that the environment around him had been shaped by it. He looked for the honor logic, the implicit acknowledgement, present in every military language he had ever studied, that the violence was in service of something beyond itself, that there was a limit, a point at which one side, having assessed the mathematics clearly, would recognize the weight of evidence against continued expenditure and withdraw their remaining strength intact, because to do otherwise served nothing. He had found this logic in every engagement in the 40 worlds record, even the most asymmetrical of them. The losing side always reached the point. He could not find it here. The mathematics were visible. The weight of evidence was not in question. The men who had just taken the stairwell were immediately replaced by men attempting to retake it. And neither group appeared to be acting on any calculation he could recognize as military logic. He looked for the end condition, the moment when the cost would exceed any possible gain and the engagement would resolve. He waited for it. The simulation continued. The cold continued. The noise continued, layered and without rhythm, unchanged from the moment he had arrived. The stairs changed hands. He noted this and continued to wait. The men who had taken the stairs were replaced, and the noise did not change. The cold did not change. The engagement continued at the same intensity it had maintained since his arrival, as though the expenditure had made no difference. The stairwell changed hands again. Judson stood in it and waited for the engagement to do what every engagement he had ever studied had eventually done. The mathematics were visible. They had been visible since he arrived. They remained visible, and they did not resolve. The stairs changed hands. And again. The building remained destroyed around all of them. The simulation ended. The suite was quiet, warm. It took him a moment to register the absence of the noise. The cold, not as relief, simply as fact. Flynn was waiting when Judson opened his eyes. He gave Judson a moment, then he spoke, calmly, and without editorializing. That was one engagement, he said, in one building, on one street, in one city. The city was called Stalingrad. It was one position along a front that extended for over 3,000 kilometers. And it was one front of several in a war that covered, at various points, most of the human homeworld. The engagement for the city as a whole would last 5 months before it concluded. The fighting Judson had observed in the immediate area of that building was one of several hundred simultaneous engagements occurring within the city on that single day. Judson said nothing. He was trying to build a structure for what he was hearing. He had a framework for war, defined objectives, defined forces, defined conclusion conditions. What Flynn was describing used the same vocabulary and none of the same meaning. He had a word for the mobilization of a species as full industrial resources toward conflict. It did not exist in Praxian. He had a word for a war without defined conclusion conditions. He did not have that either. He was receiving new categories with no existing framework to file them against, and Flynn was still speaking, calmly, without emphasis, as though this were ordinary information that simply needed stating. He sat very still. It was the only thing he had left to do. Flynn defined total war, the complete mobilization of a species' industrial capacity, its economic infrastructure, and its entire available population toward conflict, conducted against itself, simultaneously across multiple theaters of operations, with no aspect of civilized life remaining outside the scope of the effort. Every factory, every supply chain, every able-bodied member of the population, combatant or otherwise, absorbed into a machine whose only purpose was the defeat of an opponent doing exactly the same thing on the other side of the line. He stated the scale. The Eastern campaign that Judson had observed, a fragment of had consumed millions of combatants over its full duration. The casualty figures for the war as a whole ran between 70 and 85 million dead, combatants and civilians combined. Flynn noted that the range reflected documentation gaps rather than uncertainty about the order of magnitude. Not all deaths had been recorded. The count of deaths too scattered to document fully was itself a significant number. This was the second such conflict, Flynn said. The first had concluded a bit more than 2 decades before the second began. Both had occurred before first contact. Both had occurred without any external threat to prompt them. He said all of this the way he said everything, without emphasis, without comment. He was providing context, as he had said he would. Judson filed the terms with the care of a chronicler, receiving vocabulary he did not yet fully understand. Total war. World. He received them from Flynn directly, in this room, and they entered his working index as new categories for things that had not previously existed in any framework he held. And with them came the question, arriving differently than it had before. 40 worlds. Is that really all? Flynn did not follow him out. Judson did not ask him to. He walked back through the lower corridors alone, past the terminals and the storage racks, and took the lift to the receiving floors. He returned to the archive alone. The receiving floor was quieter than it had been. The submission process was complete. The 40 worlds record was still in the display queue. Judson tapped in the authorization and stood before the display stage as the record initialized. He watched it from the beginning. The anthem played its 3 measures. The first engagement opened the way it always had. He watched all 40 worlds. He was looking for what had not been in the simulation. He let the silence sit for the 9th world as he always had, and this time understood what it had always been acknowledging. Not excellence, but the limit of it. The species the Praxians had met had fought, some of them seriously and with genuine courage, and the full conviction of peoples defending everything they had. They had simply never had anything that constituted a genuine threat to the force sent to bring them into compliance. The outcome of every engagement had been determined before the first engagement began. The Praxian record cited total casualties at 912,000 dead. All sides, all 40 worlds. The full 43 cycles of the campaign, it was a number Judson had cited his entire career as evidence of professional execution and the Praxian way of war. Careful, contained, proportionate. He had said so 11 times to audiences who had agreed with him, and they had all been correct by every standard any of them possessed. Flynn had cited casualties for a single conflict at between 70 and 85 million dead. The documentation gap, the deaths too numerous and too scattered to account for fully, was in itself a significant number. The gap existed not because the record-keeping had been poor, but because the scale had exceeded the capacity of any surviving authority to track it completely. Judson looked at 912,000. He did not place it next to the other figure. He did not need to. The other figure would simply be there now every time he opened this record. The Praxian figure was a number. The human figure was an attempt to account for what had been lost, and the attempt had not fully succeeded. He stood in the silence for a long, long moment.